Join me and my guest for a conversation about world building.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. This is the podcast where we learn how to become better game masters and role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. All right, guys, if you haven't seen my latest book yet, it is called The Great Book of Random Tables. It is 120, yes, 120 D100 random tables that help you cut down your GM or DM prep time by giving you options that you or your players can roll at the table. You can find that only at drivethrurpg.com. Just search for The Great Book of Random Tables. All right, enough of all that. Here's today's interview. My guest today is the former editor-in-chief of Worldbuilding Magazine. He is also the lead game designer at Smunchy Games, in addition to being a UX and UI designer for Campfire Technologies. Adam Bassett. Adam, welcome to the show.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
No problem. It's my pleasure. First, why don't we just start off? Could you just tell us what Worldbuilding Magazine is?
Yeah, so that's a super fun volunteer project that this guy named Noah started back on Reddit in like 2017, I think it was. I wasn't really involved in the first couple months. I was moving at the time and I was getting into a new job. So I almost just left, but eventually kind of got myself settled and anyway, since then it's grown a whole lot, and I was editor-in-chief of the magazine for, I think it was a little over a year. I'd have to go back and check. Vice editor-in-chief for probably about a year before that. So I've had my hand in the pot for a little while. Only recently stepped down just because you mentioned Campfire Technology and Smunchy Games. I've got a lot going on. So kind of ran out of free time to volunteer for that project as much as I would like, but still on the team. In any case, to answer your actual question, Worldbuilding Magazine, like I said, it's a volunteer project. A whole bunch of like writers and editors and artists and just people who are interested in world building kind of came together and kind of realized that there wasn't, at least at the time in 2017, there wasn't really a lot of great resources for world building that were edited or really curated in any way. And so that was kind of the initial starting point, I guess the starting point for the magazine. And since then we've started doing a lot of like interviews, not just with the community, but also trying to reach out to people who are like somewhat established within a field that relates to world building. So, for example, we've reached out to and gotten interviews with some authors and people within like the TTRPG world. Some of the ones that come to mind include Brian McClellan, which was an absolute joy for me. He is my favorite author. That was a dream. We got a chance to talk with, I think his name was Michael from the RPG Academy. He does a podcast and has like a whole resource thing. Go check out, just like look up the RPG Academy if you're not familiar. We've also had Martha Wells, and we were able to talk with, this was a very interesting one. There was a professor who taught economics, and we brought her in for our economics issue. And basically just quizzed her about like different economic systems within fantasy and sci-fi worlds that, you know, people might have read, and asked like, what's working here? What's not working here? What are some really good examples of, you know, systems that you've experienced and what aren't really working. She had a very interesting take on Harry Potter, which I won't go into, mostly because I can't really remember the details of it. But basically the gist was like that whole system, like the economic structure of it, did not work.
I would have liked to have asked, how does Star Trek work without money?
Oh yeah, that would have been a good one. Shoot. Yeah, so we've just had a really cool opportunity to work with a lot of different people because it's volunteer. People come and go over time, so we get to meet a lot of people that way, and also just through the interviews. We do art showcases as well, so we bring in a bunch of artists and kind of showcase their work and talk about how they make it, and like if they're doing. We try to reach out to people who are doing something related to world building, of course. So they might be like illustrating a fantasy world that they're writing, or just like exploring some ideas through illustration. And so that's always really interesting because we get a chance to not only learn about their process, but also some of the thought that goes into illustrating a fictional setting. Because, so often we're dealing with just words on a page because that's what, most people have access to. So it's really cool to see it from that perspective as well. And then, over time, we started adding more to the magazine because we didn't already have enough to do. We created a podcast called Worldcasting. That's currently in its third season, releasing new episodes every other week until we run out of new episodes, and we'll start season 4 at some point. And yeah, just like basically just having conversations about world building because we're all into that kind of thing. Trying to give people advice on how to better build out their worlds, trying to get them to consider things that they might not have. Like one of my big things, just because, my background is a lot of art and art history stuff. That's one of the things I went to college for. So there was one point I just wrote a whole article, or maybe 2 articles actually, about how you can use art in your setting as like a compelling world building tool, which in my experience, a lot of people don't consider. Other things might be like looking at historical events that people might not be aware of and teaching them about it through the lens of how can we use this kind of story, through the lens of world building and creating a campaign or like whatever the case may be. Actually, I listened to one of your podcast episodes where you had someone on who was just like telling old folk stories that I can't remember the exact details of, but like it was about this this dwarf who was just doing all this crazy stuff and just like what was that?
I think it's the Rose Realm of Lorien or something.
Yes, Lorien. Thank you. It's been a little while since I listened to it. I apologize.
No problem.
But yeah, like that kind of thing is sort of the stuff we do through the magazine and the podcast. Just like trying to expose people to new stuff, get them to kind of think about things in new ways. And again, through the interviews, sort of see how other people are doing world building and putting their work together.
Yeah. And I think I saw an interview with Ed Greenwood as well, who created probably one of the most familiar worlds, at least to some of my audience, which would be the Forgotten Realms.
You've heard of that too?
Yes.
Oh, cool.
I have heard of the Forgotten Realms. I have heard of that. So yes, my audience would probably be very familiar with the Forgotten Realms. So that is really neat how you're kind of digging into it and talking to people who are established world builders and known for that, as well as diving into different kind of aspects of it. And of course, we are going to talk about some of that. So I really liked how you brought up the idea of art. A people or a culture's art says so much about them. And we just kind of take it for granted, I guess, because we're kind of immersed in the culture or whatever. But, if you come into a new place and you see, artwork with, where every figure is carrying a weapon of some sort. That's going to tell you something about that world, even though that is just pictures or carvings on a wall, right?
Yeah. And on a surface level, that's absolutely true. Like, just the image itself is going to convey some kind of feeling, even if you don't go deep into it. Like, if you're writing a story or something and you describe this hall as having these paintings strung all along it, and they're all of like these chivalrous horsemen and stuff, like that paints a very different image than, something like really abstract modern art is going to give you a different sense of like who lives here and what this place is and what time period you're looking at. You can go one step deeper, especially if you look at like a time period that doesn't have as quick methods of communication. Like right now, we'll use art to tell stories, but I think oftentimes those stories are in some ways reactions to hearing news in other ways. Whereas like a while ago, the painting itself was how you conveyed some of these stories and got the word out about stuff. Whether it was, the Medici family just trying to look super cool and wealthy, because that's a story too, even if it's very biased. I'll go briefly on a tangent here, and I won't spend too much time on it because if anyone is listening to this who has heard me talk in Worldcasting, they've already heard this. But for the folks who don't know who the hell I am, there is a wonderful story about a piece of art called The Raft of the Medusa. I believe it was by Delacroix. Roughly 1600s. I'm a little rusty on my art history, so I could be off there, and I apologize. But this is one of my favorite pieces of art because there's so much story behind it. If you look at the piece, and I realize it's very hard to do on a podcast, so go look it up if you get a chance. Again, The Raft of the Medusa by Delacroix. The painting is of a group of people on this very damaged raft made from the boards of this ship called the Medusa. And long story short, what happened is this was a real boat that was navigating around Africa, and I believe it was French, and it was captained not by someone who was a great captain, but because at the time it was just sort of the people who had access to power were the ones that got their sons and daughters in charge of things, and nepotism. So anyway, this ship took a path that was not safe, and it was wrecked kind of not super far from the shore, but like far enough where it wasn't even in sight. So they got on rowboats, but there weren't enough for everyone on the ship. And they made a raft to pull with the rowboats. So they tie the raft to the rowboats and they go on. At some point, I don't know how many days into this trip, again, keep in mind they had to take some time to make the raft, get everyone in the water and go off. And they probably at this point don't really have much, if any, food. At some point, the people in charge decide that they're going too slow. They're not going to reach the shore in time. So they cut the raft off in the middle of the night and go on. Of course, much faster now that they aren't dragging the raft behind them. So the painting is illustrated as if it's a snapshot of the moment where there's only about 20 people left on this raft of like an original, I want to say it was 200 or 300. And in the very distance, if you zoom in on your phone, which I'm sure you're looking at the painting on right now.
I did. Yes.
If you zoom in on the distance, on the horizon, you'll see this tiny little speck of a ship, and that is the moment the raft has been sighted. Mm-hmm. And the people on it are rescued, all the remaining like 20 survivors, and they're brought back to France, and it's a big scandal. And the painting is made kind of as a statement, kind of as a news piece almost.
Yeah.
And it's always really grabbed me because I love the way that, you know, it's this very artistically represented thing, but it is kind of political commentary as well. Yeah. And it kind of spurs people to start thinking about, you know, the situation that brought these people to that moment. So like that kind of painting in your world building, if you have this really important historical moment within your story, you know, one way to think about it is not just how did it happen, or how did it happen from the like different sides, points of views who were there, but then how does the community respond? And one really interesting way, of course, is how does the artistic community respond? In this case, someone decided to create a beautiful painting of the moment that this raft and the survivors on it were saved. Of course, not sparing some of the more gory details. I maybe should have mentioned that when I said go look up the painting. It is a little bit gory.
Yeah.
It's just always been a very interesting lens to go through, to sort of explore the culture of a people and how they interpret some of the big events that, you know, we like to focus on, you know, the big battles and the monumental events of our stories and our worlds, but there's more to it than that.
Sure. And I think that is an interesting example to show how that art is making some other type of statement than, you know, than just recording, you know, some triumph or something like that. It's also letting you know that people in that culture were thinking about, you know, the people who were lost and thinking about. Yeah.
And we still see it today, like that kind of demonstration and like message-filled art is not gone anymore. It's changed a little bit, but like, you know, without getting too political here, I think I can safely say, like, all of the Stop Asian Hate stuff that's going on right now, like I have seen so many pieces of art kind of talking about that and how like we need to change our attitudes toward other people and treat each other with respect more and be more mindful of the hardships that, you know, the Asian community is going through, especially recently. And it's so cool to see artists kind of sharing that message through the way that they are able to do.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, obviously, yeah, it's nothing new, right? That artists are reacting to things that are happening in the culture. But in writing, you know, if you're writing a fictional world, I think that kind of detail would probably be lost on a lot of writers because well, they're dealing with so many other complex issues as well. But it would actually be a fantastic touch to kind of add that to whether you're running an RPG campaign or you're writing a novel or a short story. That would be a nice touch to have some way that you could show something that's going on in the civilization or culture without, you know, possibly being too heavy-handed. It's just here's this artwork that is being kind of reflecting what's happening at the time.
It's also an interesting character trait because I don't think you see that kind of investment in culture a ton within world building at large, but also just like your tabletop RPG campaign and those like individual stories. I don't think people spend a lot of time on that, and for somewhat good reason. I think it's a visual medium that is harder to express through, you know, orating a story or writing or reading or anything like that. So you kind of have to pick your battles, I guess.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like if you are able to make it make sense, like you have a character who is an art collector or an art thief or someone who is, invested in the local culture or something, like those are all characters who could have, use that kind of mindset and make it be something about the character more than about the art piece or what have you. But of course, it's like expressing that character in a unique and interesting way.
Sure. And the art that somebody may choose to surround themselves with, of course, reveals their character as well, right?
For sure.
So if they're in their home or their office or their castle or whatever, their spaceship, what art have they chosen to kind of surround themselves with?
It's also a really interesting tool for if you're writing, for example, and your point of view character notices that there is no art. Then that tells us, the reader, that they are looking for some kind of expression or culture or artistic kind of supplement to the surroundings, the room, whatever it is, but they're seeing nothing. And so, that gives us some idea about them too.
Yeah, absolutely. Just, kind of continuing on, we've talked about art a bit now. What are some other kind of key aspects to world building that you've maybe come across as you've, been involved with Worldbuilding Magazine and as you're doing, your own writing and creation?
One thing that I think is always important is considering how you're telling the story and what you are asking of the audience. So, for example, I'll kind of tap into one of the things that I'm working on with Smunchy Games. There's a card game that I'm working on with them called Fourth Horizon. It's not available yet, but it's in a public beta, so you can get the print and play copy, or you can get the tabletop simulator mod for free and try it out if you're interested. So this is a card game, probably most similar to Magic the Gathering. But of course, we've kind of made it our own and made some pretty significant changes to that sort of formula. I won't go into detail on that. You can go check it out on the Smunchy Games website. But one of the things that we knew we wanted to do was not just throw some stuff together and kind of haphazardly make these characters that would be illustrated on these cards. I wanted to put some actual effort into the world building behind what these characters were and what they were doing. Have some continuous stories. If you look at some of the art that we have released, you'll see there are some that are direct, linear stories. There's one that we have extracting these crystals from a machine, and then in another piece you see him selling those for some parts, and so there's a couple of these storylines that we wanted to put in. So part of that was creating this kind of world guide for Fourth Horizon, and one of the things that we had to consider when putting that together was who our audience was and what this world was for. The world is for a card game. The card game I knew was going to be sci-fi, cyberpunk kind of stuff. And so the card game was built to have basically three types of cards. Characters and actions, which are kind of your spells if you're looking at Magic. I guess sorceries and instants is a better classification. And then they also had mods, which would kind of be your auras or some kind of buff. So in going and creating the world, I knew that I really wanted to flesh out the characters, the history and the things that were going on, and the technology, because that tied directly in with the mods. And so those are probably the things that are most fleshed out. There's a whole bunch of stuff in addition, but I didn't go into great detail on the other parts because they weren't as relevant to what I was creating. And I wanted to leave some room for like further expansion as we continue with this product and the world at large. I'm also working on a team, so I would present this stuff and then they would have ideas. And like, there's one person, I can't get into the details too much, but there was one person who read through this and she was making a character and she was like, all right, so how do we make it that this person can do fire magic? And I was like, all right, let's sit down and try to work this out within the pre-established rules of this world. And so we kind of like came to a conclusion on how to like find a compromise. So I'm excited about that character. But I guess all this to kind of say, when you are world building, I think if you are doing it for a reason and not just like a casual project, because if you're just doing it for fun, you can throw all this that I'm saying kind of out the window. You just do what you want to do and have fun with it, and that's a success. But if you're doing it for like a product like this, or you're writing a story or making a campaign, I think you have to prioritize the things that you need for the product and then build out from there. And I think that's pretty much it, is just like figuring out what you need and then working off of that. And I guess if I can add anything, just allow room for collaboration and expansion. Especially like if you're playing a campaign with some friends or something, like you want your friends to be able to create an impact on the world. You don't want it to just be like them playing out your vision. So
that I learned that lesson, when I was like a teenager after cramming my players through all of my dreams and things, and then realizing that it's like, oh, they'll have more fun if I just like loosen up and let them add a bit here and there to the world. I had to learn that a little bit hard way as well. I'll just briefly go over this. I tried leading a kind of homemade Avatar: The Last Airbender campaign. I made up a whole bunch of like character classes for it. It was just a really fun project to make, but then I actually had to run the campaign, which I was less adept with. There was one friend of mine who, like, the characters were supposed to go through this bar or something and get some information and then like infiltrate basically. And one of them did not do that, but he rolled a perfect 20 to, or natural 20 to like successfully get through whatever obstacle I put in their way. And my response was not to let him succeed, but to let him succeed by burning the entire place down, which like inadvertently did bring like around the success condition basically. But it's a running joke now that if you roll a nat 20 at the table, you burn everything down. Oh gosh.
So don't do that.
Yeah. Well, I had a lot of players back in the day when I was running a lot of Star Wars campaign. They would always blow up the cantina. I don't know. And like, I wouldn't do it. They would just, they're going there for just to have a drink or something, and they end up blowing up the cantina. I don't even know what was going on with them, but so I'll remember if in Adam's games, if it's a nat 20, it's burn the place down. So
yeah, I don't lead games anymore. I've learned it's not my forte.
Oh yeah. Okay. Well, we and the game sounds awesome, by the way, and it's kind of interesting with like a cyberpunk kind of feel, because obviously a lot of times we think of world building, especially in the context of, fantasy worlds. Thanks to some of the famous ones. We already mentioned one, say like Forgotten Realms or Lord of the Rings, so we think of some famous ones, but of course, science fiction requires a lot of world building as well, depending on kind of what you're, what kind of story you're telling. And, cyberpunk is no different, because I would assume, right, the different types of modifications that you can add to yourself even those will start telling you kind of what the world is like. Is it more a, kind of an 80s inspired kind of cyberpunk? Is it like far future where everything's wireless kind of cyberpunk? Or is it, a touch of the Victorian, kind of steampunk where everything is like really big and clunky? Those would even start to tell you about the world that you're inhabiting there.
Yeah, I mean, those are all fantastic questions when you're considering what genre you're working in, or genres, because you can have multiple, of course. I think it's a really good question to ask what kind of take you're going to bring to that genre, and how you're going to differentiate your version from someone else's. One thing that we are doing with Fourth Horizon, it's not a super in-your-face thing, but we're kind of designing the illustrations, especially, and sort of the vibe of each kind of region of this world. They're all kind of cyberpunk, but there's one that is definitively cyberpunk, and then the other 4 have influences from other punk genres. So, for example, one has a little bit like bulkier, less refined technology. They're kind of behind the curve because of some things that happened through their history that kind of prevented them from really taking the time to research and expand on technology in the way that others did. And they're still using fossil fuels and kind of just stuck in the past almost a little bit, but kind of able to take things that other regions are making and then iterate on them, or something along those lines. So we're bringing in a lot of like almost like diesel punk imagery into that part of the world. There's another one where they're very interested in like conservation of the natural world, because the native world of this secondary planet is kind of under assault by the stuff that was brought from Earth. It's not as hardy or really resilient as like Earth flora and fauna. So they're trying to like conserve it, learn from it. They're interested in kind of creating a better world than Earth was, learn from their past mistakes, all that kind of stuff. Their imagery is influenced, again, still by cyberpunk. They've got those things, but we're kind of pulling in from solarpunk as well for that. And so each one kind of has this very distinct visual color palette and style that I haven't really seen replicated anywhere else. But of course, you still have that kind of grounding of the pure cyberpunk region where you look at that and you're like, oh, I understand this. So yeah, I guess that's kind of our answer for how you differentiate within the genre. And if you are, I guess my general advice portion is here now. If you are creating something as well, and it's, kind of within an established genre or genres, a really good question as you go into it is how does mine stack up against others? And if you even want to do that, because again, some projects might just be kind of indulging in what that genre is. Like if you just really like, sword and sorcery fantasy, just make a fun sword and sorcery fantasy story. Like that's all it has to be. I realize I'm giving very contradictory answers, but that's just kind of what world building is. Like It is kind of a mode of self-expression and, allowing you to create something that you're interested in. And if you're not interested in it, you're not making what you should be making.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just thinking too, we had kind of touched on art, but obviously there are a lot of other facets to culture. And maybe before, we kind of move on a little bit more, I was just thinking of, ways that architecture could also kind of, kind of let people know what kind of world they're in without, a lot of exposition. And I'm just thinking of perhaps a famous one, say when you're in, in the Lord of the Rings, the hall of the Rohirrim Edoras is all wooden. It's just everything's made out of wood. In Minas Tirith, the Great Hall is all made out of finely dressed and carved stone. Like there is no wood. There's nothing wood. So, we went into a little with art. What would you think about architecture? Have you ever thought about that in kind of in reference to world building?
Oh, yeah. I think you summed it up pretty nicely there. I would just add, like, if you're not sure where to start, look at similar groups or time periods to what you are working on. So, for example, if you're doing some kind of fantasy story, look at a similar time period and see what they were building with. And for anything that's like a really old building within that time period, look at something a few hundred years before. Like if you look at, let's talk about churches real quick, I suppose. I don't remember the name of it, but there was a early Christian church made around 900, around 900 CE, I think. And that, I think, was one of the first like organized Christian churches. Again, I could be wrong. My art history is a little bit rusty. But right. it's very interesting because that building is like, it's basically just a rectangle. There's nothing. It's like a rectangle with pews. That's it. That's your church. And then you go to like the Italian Renaissance, I think was when the San Quattro Aefonte. I butchered that so badly. So it's the Church of Four Fountains or something like that. So do one of those. We're going to do a Google search live right now. San Quattro Aefontaine. San Quattro Aefontaine. Okay, yeah, that was Baroque 1646. So that's very different. I'm not looking at it right now, but from my memory, it's basically, like you said, all made of stone, and it's got these really elegant, like curved architecture. It's so unique. It's one of the more unique pieces I think you would find during the Baroque period. But of course, that period is like kind of known for these very elegant designs. So like if you, for example, are writing something within that time period, you could have your characters go to a really ornate building like that, and then contrast it with this old town that still uses this extremely old, church, like the 1900 CE Christian church, which is very, very simple and just kind of fits the needs for people to organize and be under a roof. So yeah, I guess that's my advice, is just like look at history, and if it's like sci-fi kind of stuff, look at present day is probably a good place to start. Where like for Fourth Horizon, one thing that I've done is consider how people live in general, and then compare that to like the lobby of a big corporation is a really interesting thing to look at, especially when you're looking at cyberpunk stuff.
Yeah.
Versus like a hotel or a government building. Like all of these things have different aesthetics to them. And, you can also kind of bring in, I think, for all of its faults at release, Cyberpunk 2077 did a really interesting job with the art direction of its world. That's a really, really cool place to look for some inspiration with, futuristic stuff. Mass Effect, of course, is another great example. There's plenty of stuff out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And you kind of reminded me of something when you started, talking about the cathedrals or the churches, that I found interesting with world building. I had watched a documentary not too long ago about the Moors when the Moors invaded into Spain, and that kind of the Gothic churches, the Goths had built these churches. Well, then they became mosques, and with adding on to them. And then after the Moors were driven back out, then they became Catholic cathedrals again. And they had elements from those three different time periods still remaining, like the columns from the Gothic, church was still there, the open wide doors, and and I think it was even like an orchard from a mosque was still there. And then the Catholic cathedral was built using those pieces as, the foundation and the framework. And I just kind of, started thinking along those lines of thinking of, reading novels or short stories, and thinking that a lot of times what they're missing is that kind of layering on of cultures. Yeah. And, and I just thought that it added a richness, of course, in the real world. But, I just thought a lot of things kind of missed that there was always something before that. What is the present, right?
Yeah. If history has taught us anything, it's that, people just kind of build on top of whatever was before, or use earlier styles and iterate on them. Like, because using your example, the style used by the Moors when they came into Spain, like that wasn't just their, like they didn't really have a style. It was adopted, like this mixture of Byzantine and Assyrian, I think it was, and maybe some like Jewish influence. I'm blinking on the third one. But if you look at the Dome of the Rock, which was one of the earliest Arabic architectural projects, it was like the Byzantines and the people they conquered basically who built that. And you can see very clear similarities between that and some of the surrounding architecture of the time, of course, kind of like all brought together and influenced by the people who oversaw the project, the conquerors. And then that, of course, gets carried to Spain, and then they get inspired by the stuff that the Spanish had already made, and inspired by, I think there was like some, I want to say like French and Italian inspiration possibly as well within the mosque at Cordoba. And like you said, the Spanish took it back and then did their own stuff on top of that. Like it just all compounds on itself. And I realize that can be very hard to put into a novel or a short story, especially when it's a totally original world. Like you can't just casually say, oh, this is Byzantine, and have people know what that means.
Yeah.
So it can be a very complex problem to have. And I think that's part of why you don't see it as much. But I agree. Whenever I do see a setting that is kind of self-influential, if that's the right terminology, whenever I see that, it is nice just to kind of see like how all the pieces come together and relate to one another.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you pick up a novel that's, relying on either a fantasy world or a science fiction world, what would tell you that it's good world building?
Oh God. Reading it.
Well, there you
go. I mean, there's not really like a tell.
Okay.
I think you just have to go through it. And I mean, after reading a couple chapters, I think you start to pick up on how much time the author has invested into fleshing out the world, or how good they are at bullshitting how much time they've invested into fleshing out the world.
Yeah. I think always one for me that tells me that kind of throws me off a bit is the kind of 150-page intro into all of the politics, starting with the third age of the gods, and then before man arose, before I care about anybody, right?
Yeah, you can get away with a little bit in like a short movie because it's like you can put some pretty visuals to it and it's fine for like the first couple minutes, but like when you're reading, you really need to make people care about what they're reading. And yeah, lore dumps like that are never super fun. Like, unless it's a World of Ice and Fire sort of situation where like the person buying that is already interested in the world, so they just want more.
Yeah. Well, I mean, going along with that, right? Like Lord of the Rings compared to the Silmarillion.
Yep.
I was already in with the first sentence of The Hobbit, so I'm just going to read anything he writes. So Silmarillion, just tell me, dump it all. But of course, you had to have The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings before that.
You have to get your readers invested in the stories that you're telling, and you can do that through character-driven stories like The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. And once you have them invested in the world through those characters, then you release like the big world guide and everything. One thing I will say too is, on the mention of a world guide, they can be very handy, especially if you are working on a team or just need to organize and remember what you are even talking about. But one thing that I learned, I mentioned we interviewed Brian McClellan for the magazine. One thing that he mentioned is he really went in without really a strong plan for his world building with the first entry of his Powder Mage series. That's something that he mentioned he regretted in some ways. And he kind of paid for a little bit with like having to go through and it kind of in this very time consuming way, check his sources. He actually, I don't know if everyone knows this, his story, the Powder Mage stories are potentially coming to TV. I don't know the specifics behind that. I don't think they totally do yet either, but there was a announcement somewhat recently. I think it was like it was the guy who created the Dark Matter, and I think like Stargate SG-1, maybe some kind of Stargate story.
Okay.
Is working with Brian to put his stories on TV and writing a pilot and stuff. And so he was posting on Twitter like, yeah, I'm rereading the first story, and part of it I think was to kind of get himself back in that mindset and remind himself of what happened, but also just like he said in the interview, like he didn't really document or fully flesh out the world when he was writing that. So a lot of it was just off the cuff. If anyone's read that, one of the main characters who persists through like the entire first trilogy, Adam, he is, I think he was just kind of made on the fly, and Brian just happened to like him, so he kept him in. So I guess all this to say, kind of depending on your project, you don't necessarily need a big world guide. Like I said, I think they can be helpful for certain projects, but like if you're just writing a short story or like a one-off novel, or you're just kind of having fun with it and pantsing along, you don't necessarily need to put all that time and energy into writing one of these things, because trust me, it can be a lot of time and energy to create a decent world guide. Like I said, we made one for Fourth Horizon, and that took me, oh God, That took me 8 or 9 months, and I think it's at 200 pages.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
Well, it was a little more effort than needed, not going to lie.
Yeah. And of course, I can see in your case why that was very important, especially you know, working with the team and that. For people out there who are running tabletop RPG campaigns, I don't really recommend the big the big world guide. I like, as we had mentioned before, you know, if the game master comes up with like a kind of a core idea and then let the players kind of fill it in and let the world build on the fly kind of in an organic way, I think always works better for tabletop RPGs. And I can see it too in writing novels to where depending on what type of writer you are, if in, like, say in your case, if you go ahead and write a 250 page world guide, you may be done writing. you may be tired of it already. Yeah. So I can definitely see where the author you mentioned was just kind of going where, you know, he was interested and kind of putting in interesting things, and then realizing later that you have to create some consistency there. But if it helps you out, you know, why not?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is always just, so long as you can find whatever you need to find to keep a level of consistency in your setting, that's probably the most important thing. So that, like, for example, if you're leading a campaign, if your characters go back to a town that you've already visited, you don't want to struggle to, you know, redescribe that town. You just want to be able to pull up that information again. So as long as you have some sort of system that helps you within kind of the scope of what you're doing, then that's all you need.
Yeah. And now your day job is actually a kind of an organization software kind of built for writers and people organizing.
Wow, worlds. What a transition.
Right? I know. There. I almost sounded like a pro.
Almost like you're a podcast host.
I know. And like, we didn't talk about that before.
No, not at all. Oh, off the cuff. Didn't see that coming. Yeah, so I'll just mention that briefly. All this stuff with Smunchy Games and Worldbuilding Magazine is stuff that I kind of do on the side. I really enjoy it, and it's been awesome to do, but you got to pay the bills. I went through a short-term kind of like schooling thing through Flatiron School. They had a program with UX and UI. Long story short, that's user experience and user interface. Kind of like user experience is, where do I put this button on the website? And what should the text be on it? And UI is, how pretty should the button be? And what colors should they be? So things like that. So yeah, I am the UX and UI designer at Campfire Technology. We're working on a bunch of really cool stuff right now to help writers and game masters and whoever kind of organize their project. And the big thing right now is Campfire Blaze, which is this really customizable tool to do that. You can write in it, you can organize your characters and locations, and use some tags to kind of connect them all, make your own custom templates and how you want to represent that. We're working on a bunch of big projects right now for later this year. I can't talk to them at length, but right now I can say I'm working on a mobile application, which people will be able to download. And we're also working on a separate desktop app. So if you don't want to work in the browser, you can work on that instead.
Okay. No, that sounds really cool. Anything to keep organized sometimes can be a huge help. Well, you know, Adam, I've had you on here a long time. We've been chatting a while. Where can people learn more about Campfire and learn more about you and your work with Worldbuilding Magazine and all of that? I mean, and Smunchy Games.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, Smunchy Games too.
Yeah. Sorry, I have too many things going on.
No, that's all right. Yeah, if you added one more, I'd get really confused.
Yeah. No, I can't do that. So I would just say go to Twitter, honestly, is the easiest thing. All of those places have a different Twitter handle. You can find me at Adam C. Bassett. All like Worldbuilding Magazine and Campfire and Smunchy all have their own accounts and everything. I think you can find them all on like your preferred social media if you don't like that. I think just Twitter is probably the most active one. They all also have Discords. If you're interested in getting to be a little more closely a part of those communities, like you want to come chat with us at Worldbuilding Magazine about your world building, like we have people who just come over there and ask questions and give feedback and stuff like that. We've got like weekly prompts that you can come and show off or answer. So you can join that Discord community. You can join Smunchy Games. You can join Campfire. All the devs at Campfire, including myself, actually, we're fairly active, responding to people in that community. Probably the easiest place to reach us aside from like email and stuff. So like we've actually had times when like somebody in the Discord would be like, it'd be really cool if the software did this. And then like the next update, we're like, hey, we're doing this now.
Well, that's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah, no, it's super cool to be a part of that like reactive team. But yeah, I would say Twitter and Discord are your best bets. You can probably find, not me, but you can find the different organizations on like Facebook and all that stuff too.
Okay. And I will make sure and link up to those in the show notes to this episode at dicegeeks.com. So anybody who's listening, just head over to dicegeeks.com, find the show notes for this episode, and you'll be able to find the links to Adam's Twitter, as well as Worldbuilding Magazine, Smunchy Games, and Campfire Technologies. Well, Adam, it was a pleasure to get to speak with you today. Really interesting stuff on world building. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was a good time. Let me know if you ever want to do it again.
All right, there you go, guys. That is today's episode. I really hope you enjoyed my conversation with Adam. As I mentioned in the show, I have provided links to Worldbuilding Magazine and to Adam's Twitter in the show notes for this episode. You can find those at dicegeeks.com. So head over there, check it out. All right, guys, if you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You'll get 10 free dungeon maps. You'll never miss an episode of this show. And each and every Friday, you will get an email update from me letting you know what I am up to in the mad, mad world of Dice Geeks. If you enjoy this show, please consider supporting it in some way. I really need your help, okay? Please consider liking, rating, subscribing, or leaving a review wherever you're listening to this podcast. Those things help the show immensely. Also, if you would like to support the show financially, that would be amazing. Okay? You can do that at patreon.com/dicegeeks. Any financial support is greatly appreciated. I thank you so much for listening, and until next time, keep gaming.